Yeah, this morning's talks were all on, or most of them anyway, sort of on big issue topics. This afternoon, well, this talk, I'll be talking about sort of a few very specific issues, which obviously are related to the big picture ones, but they are fairly narrow. And the history, I should just say a bit about the history of Australia. I won't go back 120,000 years, that would take a while, but the Indigenous people did live in Australia for a long time, and the reports are it was somewhere between 60 and 120,000 years. And when the Europeans came, well, and settled, there were different Europeans who came, the Portuguese, the Dutch and so on, landed but didn't stay. When the British came, that was sort of in the 1770s, 1780s, then they settled in, 1788, sort of the official date of European settlement in Australia. And well, from the European perspective, or the British perspective, it was called, settlement. From the Indigenous point of view, it was invasion or conquest of both. And ever since that time, there have been conflicts between the Westerners' use of land and the Indigenous use of land, and those conflicts are still going on now. And there are three that I want to mention specifically, but I want to talk first of all about some of the slightly more general issues. So, introduction, some conflicts, underlying environmental values, conflicts revisited in the light of what I've said previously, then resolving the conflicts, and then the conclusion. Now, one slightly sensitive topic in Australia is how does a Westerner approach talking about Indigenous culture? Because we don't understand it in the way that they understand it. Their background, our backgrounds are so different. And I mean, they don't mind non-Indigenous people talking about it. And in fact, they welcome that because it shows that we've got some interest. But they don't want us to make out that we're authorities, which would be silly anyway, because we're not. And this, in this book, I say you can talk about it, but don't think you can become an authority. This is on Indigenous culture. You don't need to be an expert to understand the knowledge processes of people from other cultures and enter into dialogues with them. So I don't have to become an expert on Indigenous culture, but what I have to do is understand my own culture and the way it interacts with these other cultures, and that's what I've been trying to do. And all of my information on Indigenous culture in this talk comes from a lot of reading I've done, and where possible it's been reading by Indigenous writers, not just historians and anthropologists, although obviously they're important as well. But most of the quotes that I've got here are from actually Indigenous people themselves. Now, before I get on to that, just the conflicts that I want to look at. Ongoing ones, there's land use, because obviously Indigenous people didn't have big sheep farms in Australia. They didn't build cities like Melbourne and Sydney and so on. So land use is one thing, sacred sites, and in fact a lot of the conflicts are about sacred sites. And the cases I want to look at, one of them's Uluru, which some of you will have heard of. It's that big rock in the middle of Australia. The Adani coal mine, that's in Queensland, which is creating quite a few problems because some of it's on Aboriginal land. and the Western Highway. This is widening a big road that is going to cause a destruction of certain sacred trees and so on that have been there for hundreds of years. So I want to look at those conflicts later after I've looked at some of the more general issues. Right, so this is sort of an underlying way that these Indigenous people say that, or how they see the difference between Indigenous values and Western values, at least Western values in Australia. And they use the word Gunya for white Australia, and they use different parts of Australia use different words for both themselves and for white Australians or European Australians. Well, probably, white Australians in the first instance. Our traditional and Gunya way of looking at land are diametrically opposed. Our traditional view of the land is spiritual. The Gunya view is commercial. To our people, land is a life force to be revered, maintained with sacred rituals and held in trust for one generation to the next. To Gunyas, land is a commodity to be bought and sold, to be exploited for profit by clearing, cultivating, grazing, building, quarrying and mining. So you can see straight away that from their perspective, the Indigenous perspective, there's a big contrast between the Western and the Indigenous ways of looking at land. Now here, this is my understanding of sort of three of the main concepts that I think underline the way they look at it. And I'm not giving this as gospel, but from what I've read, what I've talked to, what I've heard, people I've talked to and so on, it seems more or less right. They talk about Mother Earth. They talk about kinship and totems. They aren't strictly speaking the same thing, but they're closely related. And they talk about sacred places. And a sacred place for Indigenous Australians is a bit different from what we might think of as a sacred place like a church or a mosque or something. And I'll talk more about that later too. So my discussion of the way Indigenous Australians, or the values underlying their view of land, is land use, will be based on those three things. This is obviously a fairly big oversimplification. Now this person says we call country the mother because as a mother cares for her children, so does the land care for us. And that's a theme in everything you read on Indigenous people, and when you hear them talk, when you talk with them and so on. You get this. We belong to the land because Mother Earth feeds us and births everything. Harrison, I can't remember his first name, is one of the elders on one of the groups down in the southeast of Australia. You look at the devastating drought, that's what we're having at the moment. It's a clear indication that Mother's sick. We have to show some care for Mother and heal her. So this whole idea of denying that humans are having an effect on the climate and on the world would certainly be one that's completely foreign to them. I mean, it's just built into their culture. So, okay, so this Mother Earth concept is, or viewing the Earth as a mother is central. And I'll get back to that a bit towards the end of the talk. Now the kinship and the totems. Totemism is a view of nature and life of the universe and man which unites them with nature's activities and species in a bond of mutual life-giving. All natural and supernatural phenomena that together form the dreaming are categorised among kin. Now the Indigenous people in Australia talk about dreaming, about dream time, and it's sort of the time when things started, but it's also continuing. It's almost a timeless thing. So it certainly hasn't got anything much to do with the Western concept or the English concept of dreaming, right, which is something unreal in a sense. For them, this dreaming or dream time is when things began, when they began, when everything began, and it continues now. Everything we take from the land and the sea, plants, berries, animals, fish, we ask these things permission or thank them as they are giving up their life for us to eat. The central idea, I think, here between kinship and why their view of land is so, and nature in general is so different from the Western one, is that their view of kinship is very different. Now, I can be kin, I have children, I have grandchildren, I have cousins, all of this sort of thing who I consider my kin. And they have that sort of thing too, although it's a bit broader with people than the Western one, or the European one anyway. But they can also have kinship with other creatures, depending on when they were born, where they were born, and so on. So their kin could be a kangaroo or a kookaburra or a koala, or even a rock or a tree or something, right? So the notion of kinship, while it's related to ours, is a much broader thing, and it ties into the land in the way that our notion of kinship doesn't tie us to the land. Ours ties us to people, but it doesn't really tie us to places in the way that the Indigenous one does. And the third thing then was sacred places. I thought I was going too fast, but then I noticed that clock isn't actually going. Sacred places. This is that Aboriginal elder I mentioned before. The spirits show themselves in the rocks and trees in natural forms. These spirits come from the land and the same as us. The spirit is in the rock, the spirit is in that tree because it's born from Mother Earth. There's no separation between us. So they have this view that spirits are in natural objects as well as being in people. You often hear an old black fellow, and this isn't being racist, this is the word they use. You often hear an old, and they also talk about white fellas, you often hear an old black fella trying to say, that's a sacred tree or that's a sacred rock. And people telling him garbage. People just don't, and then he's saying, people, that is Westerners, just don't understand our spiritual connectedness with the spirit of that tree or the spirit of that waters or that rock. It's so hard to explain and get people to understand our traditional practices of being in touch with our spiritual ancestors. There's a lot of these things that they see as sacred places were beings that were involved in creating the earth and then turned into a rock or a tree or some sort of place, or into a star or a constellation of stars or something like that. So everything is united. People, trees, animals, rocks, everything. So, I mean, that obviously is a very different sort of way of looking at the world from the Western one. Everything within country is alive and sentient, and people are part of this vibrance. We're in relation with place and with animals and all beings, including rocks and waters and trees. And that's why, or one of the reasons why, often if somebody wants to build a road or put a building up or clear some land, um, to them it's desecrating something sacred because it's part of their world. Oh, it's obviously part of their world, but I mean it's part of their spiritual world, not just a material thing separate from them. Okay, so that's that's sort of just a thumbnail sketch of what I take to be some of the main issues or main beliefs to do with Indigenous beliefs with respect to the environment, and conflicts, something that I want to talk about today. It's obviously much more complicated than I put here, but this is, I think, enough to see where the main conflicts lie. Okay, in the Western view of the world, our view comes mainly from the Old Testament, although I think it's been modified or desecrated or something on the way. And in the Old Testament, I think that, I mean, I'm not a theologian, but it seems to me that there are two different ways of looking at the relationship between humans and the rest of creation. And one is from early in Genesis, and God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." Right, so this is very much a view that humans are superior to everything else, and it's our role to dominate them and use them for our own benefit. But then there's another view that comes, or another way of looking at it that comes up a little bit later. And the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to tend it and to keep it. And then the land is mine, and you have been aliens and my tenants. Throughout this country that you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. Now this second one isn't so much domination, it's looking after the land that you've been given. You're only my tenants, you're not the owners of it, whereas the first one is much more domination. Now I think it's fairly easy to see that certainly in countries like, well, probably all Western countries, the focus has been more on domination than stewardship. But even with the stewardship view here, it's still putting people above the rest of creation in some way, because it said, throughout this country that you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. It's still something there for you to look after. You are not really part of it in the sense that I was talking about in the Indigenous view. Now there are probably more subtle things in the Old Testament too, but these are sort of the two that stand out: the domination view and the stewardship one. And as I said, it's my contention that certainly in the capitalist world we put nearly all the emphasis on the domination. Okay, now I talked a bit about the values in the Indigenous world in Australia. Now these, you can challenge these values, but they seem to me to be all fairly much common sense ones. I mean, common sense in the sense that they are predominant values, at least in capitalist societies. Profitability, and that whole notion came up in a few talks this morning. Efficiency, you always have to do things efficiently as possible, but the efficiency is usually talked about in terms of less labour and more profit or something like that. We don't often talk about efficiency in terms of, well, this is going to take you a bit longer to do, but it's more fun, so it's more efficient in the sense of being happy. We don't talk about it, well, we tend not to talk about it like that. Materialism is rife. Possessions, that's closely related to materialism, of course. And there's a strong environment. There is, this isn't one of the bottom one, isn't really one of the values. It's just saying, well, we do have a strong environmental movement, but the common values, the ones above the four I've got there, tend to be the ones that dominate. Somebody at home wrote a paper a while back lamenting the fact that environmental ethics has been around now, I don't know for how long, 30, 40 years, and it doesn't actually seem to have had much effect. We're still wrecking the world probably at a faster rate than we were before. So these values tend to be more influential than the environmental movement that's around. It's not saying that doesn't have an effect, the environmental movement, but it's fighting an uphill battle. Okay, now this is what seems to me to be a comparison. In the Indigenous world, there's no difference between humans and nature, right? Humans are bottom. Okay, there's a difference between me and a kangaroo, but we're all part of nature, right? And trees and rocks, so everything is united. So I don't only have to look after my children or my family or friends. I also have to look after all these other parts of nature as well. And then they'll look after me at the same time. Whereas in the West, the typical view seems to be something like that. God's more important than we are. He created us. We're down here and we're more important than nature. Right? So you have God, humans and nature in a way that isn't here. Where there is spirituality here, again, that's all united with humans and nature. So there's no way that in the Indigenous world view that it makes any sense to say that God is invisible, because God's well, spirits anyway are everywhere. Whether they or some of them believe in one God is a bit in dispute. Some will talk about one initial creator, but even if others won't. But anyway, it's sort of all the spirits, nature, humans are all related. So if you put it like that, and if this is only even roughly accurate, it does show that there's a very big gulf between the way Western or European Australians look at the world and the way Indigenous Australians do. Certainly big, but a lot of them still do. Now I want to look at these conflicts just briefly, three of them. Uluru. For a long time, it was called Ayers Rock after some Englishmen, and then it was decided that, well, perhaps the Indigenous people had a name for it, seeing they lived around there for so long and it was a spiritual place to them. So then that was one of the few sensible things that's happened in recent years. The name was changed to Uluru. Now the reason this has been in the news in recent times is that now I've never in fact been there yet, but I must go there one day. I'm not sure where, but there people climb there all around. Right. Now there was no proper walking track up, but for part of the steepest way, they put in posts and a chain, so you had something to hang on to. But over the years, I think about 30 people fell off and died. Well, some had heart attacks on their way up because it's very hot and steep. But all of this time that people were climbing it, the Indigenous people said, well, we don't really want you to climb it because it's a sacred site for us. And they put signs up to say, don't climb. Well, they didn't say you can't climb it. They said, we prefer you not to. And it didn't have a lot of effect. People were still climbing it. So a couple of years ago, it was decided to ban climbing. And that created quite a storm amongst a lot of people, because the Indigenous owners, they've been granted all the land around Ayers Rock, said that it was a sacred site and they didn't want any climbing on it. But a lot of non-Indigenous Australians said, well, it's part of Australia and I'll climb where I want to. It's just as much my country as it is yours. Sort of forgetting about the fact that it was a difference between, say, 200 years and 60,000 years or something. Now, obviously, this is a sort of conflict where you can't really have compromise, because you can't say, well, you can climb it a little bit because I didn't want any climbing, right? So it's either climbing or no climbing. And given that it's a sacred site, it's not clear what compensation they would get if they gave up. The Nangu believe that during the time when the earth was being formed, the Uluru climb was a traditional route taken by their ancestors when they arrived at the rock. For them, particular places on and around the rock are the sacred equivalents to a church, a synagogue or a mosque. Now I suspect it was even a stronger, significance was even stronger. And that the Nangu, that's one of the groups that live there. This is another quote from a Indigenous person. White fellas see the land in economic terms, where a Nangu see it as, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce that, culture law dreaming. And if that is gone, so is everything. Right, so if they lose this dreaming site, this sacred site, they've sort of lost a big part of their culture because it's so much part of them. Now, some of the climbers, as I said, insisted it was their right as Australians to climb Uluru because it was a symbol of the whole nation, and it probably is the most recognisable bit of Australia, except perhaps for Sydney Opera House or a kangaroo, I don't know. So how was this conflict resolved? And as I said, it's not easy to see in a case like this how you can have consensus between the two groups, or certainly it's difficult to see how you can sort of meet each other halfway because it's an all or nothing situation. Now in this case, how was it resolved? Well, climbing was banned. So the Indigenous people in this case won out. One of their few victories. I suspect the reason they ran out is that, won out, is that there wasn't a lot of economic, there wasn't anything much economically to be gained by keeping the track open, because you couldn't grow wheat on it or have sheep on it, or there wasn't any gold or oil or anything there. Some people were worried that it would affect tourism, but other people thought, well, I mean, I think it was only about 15% of the visitors to Uluru climbed the rock anyway, so it wasn't going to have much of an effect on that. A lot of people thought that it didn't have any effect whatsoever. So that was one conflict where one side won, the other side lost. There was no compromise. Okay, the Adani mine. This is a mine, big, well, it hasn't been set up yet. It's a big new coal mine. The owners and the Queensland government hope, well, I hope it will be a big new mine. It's to be constructed on Indigenous land, if constructed is a good word for using when you're going to dig something up. The traditional owners obviously don't want it there by and large, whereas the government and the Adani mine owners do. And one of the traditional owners said, we're occupying our ancestral lands as we have always done. Our property rights must be treated with respect. We'll keep fighting to ensure our ancestral lands are not destroyed by the actions of the government and Adani. And this fight is still going on. Now here, I don't think that the government or the mine owners will so readily give in as the government did in the case of Uluru, the Uluru Walk, because there's big money involved. But there's also sacred land involved. Now, I just read fairly recently that the government, in fact, took the land away from the Indigenous people and gave it to Adani, so that the Indigenous people don't have any rights there anymore. But they did it without actually telling anybody at the time. Well, I presume they told Adani, but they didn't tell anybody else. That's only just come out recently. And the conflict is not yet resolved. Things are in the courts. I fear that in this case, again, there probably won't be much compromise because the Indigenous people are going to lose some sacred land. Although in a little while I'll show you, I'll just say something about what one of the Indigenous people that I talked to said he does in negotiations, so they might be able to negotiate something, but I think they'll lose a lot more than the government or Adani do. Now the Western Highway, big new road they want to build, is going to demolish sacred trees. Again, the Indigenous owners say no, the government says yes. And this is a quote from one of the Indigenous people. This is not merely about protecting individual trees, some of which are up to 800 years old. It's about the way those trees relate to each other, the landscape. Those people, that group, and their law, which have been here for thousands of generations. The site was sacred and home to traditional birthing trees that have been used by generations of Aboriginal people. So these trees aren't just any trees. I mean, if any tree gets knocked over, it's a bit sad. Well, most trees. But if these trees have got special significance, then of course it's not a matter of just being a bit sad and being environmentally destructive. It's actually destroying part of their culture. And it's not only that, you know, say there are 10 trees and they say, okay, we'll compromise, we'll knock over 2 and you can have the rest. it's not quite that, because the trees are all in this area are all related to each other in a spiritual context, in the Indigenous context. So again, it's much more like an all or nothing thing. They either get what they want or they lose pretty well everything they want. So again, how do you negotiate in a case like that? Those trees are part of us, another person said. It's not completely resolved yet. But, and another one said, we have to accept that a road will be built, but we have two objectives: minimum environmental impact and minimum cultural impact. So you can see there is some willingness to negotiate, even though they obviously don't want to, but they know that something's going to happen, so they at least want to get something out of it. And I'll get back to this again in a minute. Just in a court case that's going on at the moment. In July, the minister, that's the minister for the, minister for roads or the minister for the environment or something, found that the project would not threaten Aboriginal cultural heritage, as the state government had agreed to spare 5 sacred trees, including an 800-year-old birthing or grandmother tree. But this group of people were concerned that many other sacred trees would still be demolished, such as a 700-year-old grandfather tree, the towering yellow box called the elections tree. And these trees are related for them in various ways. So it's not a matter, as the minister said, that okay, we'll knock down a few, but you can have a few. That's not really a very good compromise. Lawyers representing Miss Lay, she's the minister, said that preserving culturally significant objects should not be pursued at all costs. Right? So there are going to be considerations which override culturally or destroying or preserving culturally significant objects. It's not clear if that same principle would be used if, say, we wanted to knock over the Vatican or something and give it a big car back on. So, and barrister, this lawyer said cultural protection must be balanced against other private interests and political interests. So you can see in this particular case, the law is saying, okay, sacred objects are important, but these economic issues, political issues are important, and they can easily be weighed up against each other. But from an Indigenous point of view, it's not clear at all that they can be easily weighed up against each other. And this case is still going. So I'll say a little bit more about the clash in a minute. But the main clash of values seems to me to be this, that in the Indigenous way of looking at things, the two big values seem to me to be respect, that comes up all the time, and care for, particularly for Mother Earth, and care for nature, because they are one and the same, or they are so closely related. And nature and humans are one. So we have all of these. The two main things seem to me to be respect and care, but given that humans and nature are related, it has to be respect and care for more than just humans, also for natural or non-human objects. The Western values, you can exploit nature for profit, material gain, and nature's merely our environment, and if we need to knock some of it down for better roads or cities or hotels or whatever, so be it. Okay, we lose something, but we gain a lot more, economically at least. So So again, you can see when it's put that way, the differences are fairly stark. Now this Mumbulla Falls, I just put this, that's a photo of a sign that's at these falls not far from where I live. And that's a sacred site too. It's where they used to take the teenage boys, I guess, for initiation. Thousands of years. It says, as a site of great cultural significance to the Aboriginal owners request that you don't swim in the falls. It says, an old way of thinking, Mumbulla Creek Falls has been used as a swimming area since the arrival of the Europeans in the early 1800s. Challenge your perspective. We invite you to open your hearts and minds to the vision of the board of management and respect their wishes, and that is that you don't swim in it. The last time I went there was a family swimming in quite happily. So they don't take much notice of these signs. But the important thing I wanted to just highlight here is the respect bit that comes up all the time. And one of the big arguments in the Uluru conflict or debate is that Westerners climbing Uluru weren't respecting the Indigenous people because they knew the Indigenous people didn't want them to do it, but they did it anyway, so there was lack of respect. Right, resolving conflicts. This is where things can get, well, they are obviously pretty tricky. If I'm trying to resolve a conflict with somebody, say over land or a house or whatever, if it's only monetary value, you can usually get some compromise. I'll give you this if you give me that. And do a cost-benefit analysis, which is a typical way of doing things. Not always a very accurate way, because if you're looking at environmental issues, a cost-benefit analysis gets a bit suspect. But anyway, that tends to be the way we do things. From the Indigenous point of view, if culture gets something of equal value, I'll start that again. This comes from one of the Indigenous people I talked to not long ago, who's been involved in lots of negotiations on land rights and things. And his view is if it's a cultural thing that you might lose because somebody wants it for monetary gain, try and get something of equal cultural value back. Now that might be difficult, but at least you're getting something of cultural value and not just economic. If economic, get something of equal economic value. So if you lose, say, a hunting ground, which is basically economic for them because it's where they get their food, then if you can give them more land somewhere or close by, then that's some sort of compensation. Some things he said were non-negotiable, like cave paintings or other sacred things. But if it's a lost cause, if you know that you definitely will lose, then you'll try and get something back anyway, even though you won't ever agree with the decision. And the things he was talking about were not monetary things, but things like better education, more or better health facilities, jobs, and so on. Now, search for common ground. And this is nearly at the end. It seems that to me that a possible way forward, this is more theoretical now, what I looked at before here, this is sort of a practical way of doing something in actual negotiations. If we're looking at a possible way forward where we can all do understand each other more, it seems to me that we can look at the areas of care and respect And as I said, these are core Indigenous values. But there are also important values in Western thought. Now, if we look at respect for Indigenous people, respect for non-human nature as well as humans is important. For the West, and this mainly comes from Immanuel Kant, we treat people, respect means treating people as ends and not merely as means. You don't just use people, you have to respect them as people. So the focus is on respect for people. But this, I think, it wouldn't be all that hard to expand our notion of respect for respecting more things, more bits of the world than just the human bits of the world. So I think that there is scope here, if we focus on respect, to see if we can find some common ground between Indigenous ways of looking at some of these problems and Western ways, because we both do put some emphasis on respect, just in different ways at this stage. Now, care, this is the way one Indigenous writer describes it. The dot's the child, the circle's the mother, and that's the core of the caring relationship. Right? If the mother didn't care for the child, none of us would be here, obviously. Well, okay, there has to be somebody playing the role of mother if it's not the birth mother. And this is the core care relationship, and everything follows from that. Care for others and care for nature follows from this relationship between a mother caring for the child. And if you look at ethics of care in Western thought, it's a fairly new theory in the West, and it started out as pretty much a feminist theory, but a lot more people have got involved in it and developed it in various ways. I mean, the core of it can still be seen there. Our duty of care for others ultimately derives from our nature as dependent creatures who need the care of others to survive and develop and function. And the ethics of care then is based on this, which is really very similar to the way that care is talked about in the Indigenous way of looking at things. So it seems to me that those two issues, respect and care, deserve a lot more work in this area, and that something can perhaps be developed. From that, okay, in conclusion, where there are conflicting values, consensus and compensation can both be difficult. That's probably almost too obvious to be worth saying, but I said it anyway. Where possible, find cultural and economic compensations rather than just always looking for monetary ones, and also looking at these ways of trying to find compensations rather than just saying, well, bad luck, we need the road, you don't need your trees. Longer term, cultures need more mutual understanding, and from an Australian perspective, I think this means everybody learning a lot more about Indigenous culture. There's not much problem about Indigenous people understanding Western culture because they're indoctrinated with it from an early age, by and large. But there needs to be a lot more emphasis in non-Indigenous Australia on values of respect and care, and learning a lot more, as I said, about what Indigenous people, or learning a lot more about Indigenous culture. When I went to school and we did Australian history, almost nothing was said about Indigenous history. Australian history more or less started when Captain Cook landed, right? And the Indigenous people were all just savages, and they, we did them a good turn by wiping out a lot of the land and taking the land. Well, actually, a lot of it was terra nullius. They believed that the land was uninhabited to a large extent because the Aborigines were nomadic. As it turns out, they have a much richer culture and developed more things than people at that time realised. So in the longer term, there has to be a lot more mutual understanding, but I think the big shift has to come from non-Indigenous Australians understanding Indigenous culture. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, John. You raised a number of questions on the comparison of the two worldviews and I guess there's fusions between these. As John went through some of the concepts, maybe some you relate to. Would you like to make some comments? Regilla, please.
Yeah, good afternoon, Professor. I really follow the presentation because I'm interested basically because I'm also working with the same paper, more in the Indigenous people, but in the perspective of the Philippines. Basically in terms of values and conflict as regards to land and other environment, they are the same. My comment is, one thing is, in your exploration with that area, especially in Australia, where there are instances where in this part of conflict, where normally the dominant and the most powerful one, especially those who have apparatus of control, will really win in terms of conflict, where in the struggle of Indigenous people to really resolve such conflict in both party, were there instances where these Indigenous people resorted to violence, just like some in the Philippines? That's one thing. And the other question I would like to raise is, the same in the Philippines, especially in the area of exploration to natural resources such as waterfalls and cave and mountains, etc. A lot of people would climb, and there have been resistance for how many years, but now as I visited some of these indigenous places, there is one thing is very, very holy, considered sacred before this. Mount Holon in lakes in south part of Cotabato is now being a tourist spot because they cannot also be, we cannot help the indigenous peoples also need money, and because of this tourism, they also have lots of money. So my question is, how really to maybe part of this is that can this be prohibited or maybe controlled, or in your opinion? So the two questions. Thank you.
Thanks. The first, well, those 2 points related. On the first point about do they ever buy land, well, there's been one big problem is that they didn't have any money, because initially they were driven off their land, and well, even if they weren't driven off by force, in a lot of cases they were, but even when they weren't, the forests and things were all cleared, so they lost all their hunting grounds. Sheep came in, the water was polluted, so a lot of them then were put in missions, a lot of them were taken away from their homelands. Because in Australia, sorry, I presume it's the case with Indigenous people everywhere, but because one Indigenous group lives in one part of Australia, it doesn't mean then that, if you want to use their land, you just pick them up and put them in another part of Australia, because this is their country. Like, they don't want to live over there any more than they want to live in Thailand or the Philippines. They want to live in this country, their country there. But yeah, getting back to your main point, because they were the way they were treated and pushed off, they didn't have money to buy anything. I mean, I think in a very few cases, some people did, but it was certainly very few with respect to sort of having enough money to develop them. Well, I don't even like using the word development because that means that having money to become more like Europeans is actually better than living the way they were. But that's the way it's often seen. A lot of them too, I mean, they just accepted that they live in a basically Western country now, so to survive, you know, they have to adopt a lot of Western ways because they just don't have enough of their traditional lands left anyway. But certainly there does need to be a lot more resources put into education and health and training police, so they're culturally sensitive, and a lot of them aren't. I mean, a lot of other Australians aren't culturally sensitive either, there's no others. But yeah, look, I think you do need a big, you need a lot of resources put into it, but it has to be done in a very sensitive way. One of the worries that some have is that if you just pour more money into education for them and so on, that can be seen as cultural genocide, because what you're doing is saying you all have to be educated in the Western way so you can go and live in Melbourne or Sydney or somewhere and get a good job. But that's not what a lot of them want. They want to keep at least some of their culture. So it's not an easy issue to resolve. I think what's healthy at the moment is that at least people are starting to talk about it. I mean, for a long time, they didn't even talk about it, it just didn't exist. But yeah, no, your point's a good one, but you know, it's hard to get the right balance between sort of forcing them to do what we think would be good for them and allowing them to do what they want to do.
Yes,
yeah, on the point that was being discussed, that's also what I noticed. I'm from South Cotabato also. So, you know, Philippines, we have 7,600 islands. Like, all of these are beautiful islands. And most of these are owned by indigenous peoples. Philippines right now is very famous in tourism. What's good with tourism is it earns much, but doesn't really destroy the nature of the place. However, if you would dig and really see it on a deeper level, those who earn from tourism are not actually the indigenous peoples or the locals. These are actually capitalists from downtown areas who have the capital to invest in creating hotels and spas and developing tourist spots that are already there owned by the indigenous peoples. At the end of the day, those who get rich out of these beautiful sceneries are not actually those who are locals of the community, but those who have the money from different places, especially in downtown areas. So the challenge here is actually to come up with a model where we could marry culture, respect, and development all together, because we could not also just let them stay there and not develop as well. They also would want better education for their children, or better food, or better health care. So eventually development would really come in the community, but the challenge is to come up with a model where culture and development would not be against each other.
Yeah, no, that's true. I think, I mean, our situation's very different because Australia's big. We don't have many islands. We've got two main ones. Australia, a big island and Tasmania. I have a few little ones, but I don't think any of the little islands was, excepting Torres Strait going up to New Guinea. There are, because we often talk about Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders because they are slightly different and slightly different customs. But in the rest of Australia, I mean, it's a big country, most of it's fairly flat. They all have very defined areas, but the areas weren't like islands in the sense that you've got in the Philippines. Yeah, it'd be interesting doing a comparison, I think, of things between sort of cultural attitudes in Filipino Indigenous people in Australia, is just given the completely different geography.
Any other comments, questions? Yeah, well, thank you very much, John. It's very interesting. Thank you.